My name is Naomi. I am 32 years old. My parents invited me to dinner to reconnect after 7 years of absolute silence. When I arrived at the restaurant, my entire family was there, 14 people. They had already ordered Alaskan king crab prime wagyu beef and vintage champagne. My father smiled and slid a $12,000 bill across the table. He told me I was paying. I did not cry. I called the waiter over, handed him a solid metal black card, and whispered a single sentence into his ear. The waiter nodded and walked away. 5 minutes later, my family learned the hard way that the daughter they threw away was no longer a struggling caterer. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who underestimated your worth. The Onyx Room is the absolute crown jewel of Buckhead, Atlanta. It is the most exclusive fine dining establishment in the city, known for catering to the highest echelon of the Black elite. Getting a reservation here takes 6 months unless you personally know the owner. My family definitely did not know the owner, but they loved to pretend they belonged at the very top of the social ladder. My father, Winston, runs a luxury logistics company. He is a man obsessed with appearances, designer suits, and projecting an image of untouchable wealth. My mother, Camille, treats her social standing like a religion, constantly worrying about country club memberships and what other wealthy families think of us. They kicked me out of the house 7 years ago because I refused to drop out of my business program to work for free at Winston's failing company. They told me I was an embarrassment to the prestigious Caldwell name. They screamed that I would never amount to anything more than a struggling cook serving food to people who were better than me. I walked into the private VIP suite, expecting a quiet, perhaps tense dinner with my parents to finally clear the air. The heavy mahogany doors closed softly behind me, sealing me inside the opulent room. The air smelled rich, a heavy blend of truffle butter, roasted garlic, and expensive designer perfumes. There were no warm greetings waiting for me, no hugs, no apologies for the 7 years of painful silence and abandonment. Instead, 14 family members sat around the massive polished dining table. My parents sat at the head of the table like royalty. My older sister Jada was there. Her arrogant investment banker husband, Kendrick, sat right beside her. Various aunts, uncles, and cousins who had all happily cut me off and ignored my existence when my father gave the order were lounging comfortably in the tufted velvet chairs. They were wiping melted butter from their lips and swallowing the very last drops of $900 champagne. The table was an absolute disaster zone of empty crab shells and cleared plates of expensive wagyu. Winston leaned back in his high-backed chair, looking at me with that familiar condescending smirk that used to make my stomach tie in knots. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask about my life, my health, or how I had survived the last 7 years. He simply picked up the thick black leather checkbook from the table and slid it across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of me with a soft thud. I looked down at the receipt sticking out of the leather binding. $12,450. Camille took a delicate sip of her sparkling water. She adjusted her heavy diamond necklace and looked at me like I was a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. She said it was time for me to pay my initiation fee. She told me that since I was just a struggling caterer, this dinner was my chance to prove I wanted to be welcomed back into the family fold. She said picking up the tab for a luxury meal would show them I was finally ready to respect the Caldwell hierarchy and apologize for my past rebellion. She spoke with a sickening sweetness, completely ignoring the fact that handing a $12,000 bill to someone they believed was broke was an act of pure financial abuse. Jada laughed loudly from across the table. She flipped her perfectly styled hair and flashed her massive wedding ring so the chandelier light would catch the diamonds. Jada had always been the golden child of the family. She married a top-tier banker and lived in a $3 million mansion, giving our parents the perfect image to brag about to their friends. She looked at my simple tailored black suit and sneered. She asked if I needed to call my bank to approve a transaction this big, or if my little food cart business even made that much in an entire year. She asked if I wanted her to leave a tip, so I would not look completely broke in front of the waitstaff. Kendrick chuckled, wrapping his arm tightly around Jada's shoulders. He loved to assert his alpha male dominance whenever he could, especially over me. He told me I should feel honored they even invited me to breathe the same air as them tonight. He said paying this bill was the absolute least I could do after being a massive disappointment for my entire adult life. He picked his teeth with a wooden toothpick and added that I should be extremely grateful they saved me a single bread roll. The rest of the extended family snickered, hiding their smiles behind their expensive napkins. They were enjoying the show. They were completely complicit in this ambush. The sheer audacity hung heavily in the air of the VIP suite. They brought me here specifically to humiliate me. They deliberately ordered the most expensive items on the entire menu, gorged themselves without waiting for me, and planned to trap me with a bill that would have instantly bankrupted the 25-year-old girl they kicked out 7 years ago. They wanted to watch me panic. They wanted to see me cry, beg, and realize I was nothing without their approval and financial support. They expected me to break down in tears and ask Winston for a loan, placing myself right back under his controlling, manipulative thumb forever. But I was not that scared young girl anymore. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice or throw a tantrum. I did not give them the satisfaction of a single emotional reaction. The panic they were desperately looking for was completely absent from my face. Instead, a cold, absolute calm washed over me. This was the exact moment I had prepared for. The moment all those sleepless nights, brutal business negotiations, and relentless sacrifices had built up to. For 7 years, I had worked 18-hour days. I had built my empire from a tiny studio apartment while eating cheap instant noodles, channeling all the pain of their rejection into raw, unstoppable ambition. While they were attending galas and buying luxury cars on high-interest credit to maintain their fake image, I was acquiring real estate, quietly buying up struggling companies and turning them into highly profitable assets. I became a ghost in the corporate world, operating through holding companies and legal trusts, so my name never appeared in the flashy headlines. My family thought my silence was proof of my failure. They thought because I was not posting designer bags on the internet, I must be suffering in poverty. They critically mistook my privacy for defeat. Looking around that long table, I saw exactly who they were. They were not a loving family. They were a collection of insecure narcissists wearing expensive clothes to hide their massive debts and empty souls. My Aunt Valerie was whispering to my cousin about how my hair looked unkempt. My Uncle Robert was subtly checking his reflection in his butter knife. They were all so deeply invested in the performance of wealth that they had forgotten how to actually be decent human beings. They were completely hollow inside. I calmly raised my hand and summoned the waiter. He stepped forward quickly, his posture completely professional and rigid. I reached into my designer bag and pulled out my wallet. I did not pull out a standard credit card. I pulled out a solid metal invitation-only black card. It landed on the receipt with a heavy, satisfying metallic clink that echoed across the silent room. Winston laughed out loud, a booming, arrogant sound that grated on my nerves. He asked if I got that fake card off the internet to try and impress them. He said real wealth is not something you can just pretend to have with a piece of painted plastic. Kendrick smirked and muttered that a caterer could never qualify for that kind of credit line. He said the machine would decline it immediately and embarrass me even further in front of the entire restaurant. Jada rolled her eyes and told me to stop playing games and just use whatever debit card I had left. I ignored them completely. I did not even look in their direction. I looked directly at the waiter. I leaned in close to him and whispered a single precise sentence into his ear. The waiter froze instantly. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He looked down at the black card resting on the leather booklet, then looked back up at me, suddenly realizing exactly who was sitting in front of him. All the color drained from his face. He bowed deeply, far lower than standard restaurant protocol dictated, his hands shaking slightly as he reached out. He took the card, nodded silently without saying a single word, and practically ran out of the VIP room to follow my exact instructions. Winston shook his head, looking highly amused by the whole interaction. He told the table I probably just spent my entire life savings trying to act like a big shot for the waitstaff. Camille smiled her cruel, satisfied smile. She patted Winston on the arm and said it was a good lesson for me to finally learn my place in the world. Jada went back to taking selfies for her social media, making sure to capture the empty caviar shells in the background to prove how elite her evening was. Kendrick poured himself another glass of sparkling water, looking incredibly pleased with himself. They all went back to chatting and laughing, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was about to collapse. They thought they had trapped a struggling caterer. They thought they had successfully executed a brilliant plan to put the family scapegoat back in her miserable place. They did not know they had just tried to extort a stealth billionaire who owned the very ground they were sitting on. They were celebrating a victory that did not exist. The timer was ticking down, and in just 5 minutes, the illusion of the wealthy, powerful Caldwell family was going to be shattered into a million pieces. The absolute destruction of their fake elite status was already in motion, and I was going to enjoy watching every single second of their downfall. Exactly 5 minutes after I handed the waiter my solid metal black card and whispered my instructions into his ear, the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP suite swung open. However, the waiter did not return alone, and he definitely did not return with a dessert menu or a receipt for me to sign. He returned flanked by 4 massive security guards dressed in immaculate black suits, their earpieces curled tightly around their ears. They moved with absolute silent precision. They did not speak to my father. They did not acknowledge my mother. They marched straight to the dining table and physically began confiscating everything. One guard smoothly pulled the remaining half-eaten pieces of Wagyu beef right out from under Kendrick's fork. Another guard reached over and grabbed the $900 bottle of vintage champagne, lifting it right out of the silver ice bucket. He then efficiently gathered the expensive crystal glasses, taking them directly from the table, even the one my mother was currently reaching for. The table was stripped bare in a matter of seconds. The illusion of luxury they had been gorging themselves on was violently interrupted. Jada stood up her chair, screeching harshly against the marble floor. She shrieked, her voice echoing off the paneled walls, demanding to know what these thugs thought they were doing. She screamed at the staff, reminding them that her husband was a top-tier investment banker and that they would all be fired for treating the Caldwell family this way. She waved her diamond ring in the face of the nearest guard, completely oblivious to the fact that he was completely unfazed by her outburst. Camille slammed her hands on the table, her face flushed dark with anger. She turned her furious gaze toward me, her eyes practically burning holes into my skull. She yelled, her voice trembling with rage, asking why I was deliberately embarrassing them in front of high society. She accused me of setting up this humiliating spectacle because I was jealous of their success. She leaned across the empty table, her designer necklace flashing under the chandelier, and snarled, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "This is exactly why we kicked you out 7 years ago." Camille spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You have always been a ghetto, ungrateful embarrassment to the Caldwell name. We tried to give you a chance to prove you belonged here today, and you do this. You have always been nothing but a parasite." Her cruel words hung in the air, instantly bringing back the memory of the night they threw me out. I was 25 years old at the time. I had just finished my master's degree in business administration. I was exhausted, but I was building a solid plan for a startup catering and hospitality business. Winston had marched into my small bedroom that night and demanded I drop everything. He told me his logistics company was restructuring, and he needed me to step in and work as an unpaid operations manager to help the family. When I politely refused, explaining I had my own investors and my own business to build, he exploded. He told me that my dreams were pathetic and worthless. He said no daughter of his was going to be a common cook. Camille had backed him up completely, packing my clothes into garbage bags and throwing them out the front door. They left me completely homeless that night, forcing me to sleep in my 20-year-old car for 3 weeks simply because I refused to be Winston's free, obedient labor. They cut me off without a second thought, and now 7 years later, they were using that exact same trauma to try and break me again. An embarrassment. I repeated, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I did not need to. The quiet power in my tone made the entire room fall dead silent. "You think I am the one embarrassing the Caldwell name tonight?" Winston slammed his fist on the table, trying to regain control of the room. He pointed a trembling finger at the security guards. "I am a respected businessman in this city. You cannot treat us this way. I demand to see the manager. I demand to speak to the owner of this restaurant right now. You are all going to regret this. You want to speak to the owner, Winston? I asked, completely dropping the title of father. I sat back in my chair, crossing my legs elegantly, watching him unravel. You are already speaking to her. Winston stopped mid-sentence. His mouth hung slightly open. The anger on his face was rapidly replaced by profound confusion. Jada stopped screaming at the guard and slowly turned her head to look at me. Kendrick let out a short, nervous scoff, completely failing to hide the sudden panic in his eyes. What are you talking about? Winston demanded, his voice dropping an octave, trying to sound authoritative but failing miserably. You run a failing food cart. Do not try to play games with me, Naomi. I signaled to the lead security guard. He stepped forward and placed a sleek black leather folder directly in front of Winston. I nodded toward the folder. Open it. Winston hesitated, then snatched the folder and flipped it open. Inside was a certified notarized document from the state of Georgia. It was the Articles of Incorporation for Obsidian Holdings, LLC, the parent company that owned the restaurant, the building it sat in, and 5 other luxury properties in Buckhead. At the very bottom, clearly printed in bold black ink, was the name of the sole founder and chief executive officer, Naomi Caldwell. The whisper to the waiter wasn't to pay your ridiculous $12,000 bill, I said, my voice cutting through the dead silence of the room. It was to activate a security protocol. I don't run a little catering business, Winston. I am the sole owner and CEO of the hospitality and venture capital conglomerate that owns the Onyx Room. You are currently sitting in my restaurant. You are eating my food. And the reason they took your plates away is because I am officially kicking you out. The color completely drained from Camille's face. She looked from the document to me, her eyes wide with absolute horror. The realization that she had just spent the last 20 minutes aggressively insulting and extorting a billionaire who owned the most prestigious establishment in the city hit her like a physical blow. Jada sank slowly back into her velvet chair, the arrogant smirk completely wiped from her face. She looked down at her empty hands, suddenly realizing how incredibly small her $3 million mansion felt compared to the empire I had quietly built while she was busy posting selfies. But the humiliation was just getting started. I wasn't going to let them off that easily. I reached into my own bag and pulled out a slim silver iPad. I tapped the screen a few times and slid it across the table toward Winston. The bright screen illuminated his pale face. Now, I continued, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the table. Let's talk about the real reason you invited me here tonight. Let's talk about the minor cash injection you so desperately needed from my trust fund. Winston stared at the iPad screen. It displayed a highly detailed, confidential financial audit of his precious luxury logistics company. The graphs were entirely red. The numbers were disastrous. Your company isn't restructuring, Winston. I stated, my voice echoing clearly so the entire extended family could hear every single word. Your company is completely, irrevocably bankrupt. You haven't been maintaining this black elite lifestyle through hard work or business acumen. You have been taking out massive predatory loans from offshore accounts just to keep up appearances at the country club. You are drowning in over $15 million of toxic debt. Winston swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the room, realizing that his biggest secret, his deepest shame, was being broadcast to the very relatives he had spent decades trying to impress. His entire identity was built on being the wealthy patriarch, and I was publicly dismantling it in less than a minute. How did you get these files? Winston stammered, his voice weak and raspy. He looked like a deflated balloon. Because my primary business isn't just hospitality, I explained, watching the terror set into his eyes. Obsidian Holdings is a venture capital and private equity firm. We specialize in aggressive acquisitions, and my firm just bought out every single piece of your corporate debt for pennies on the dollar yesterday morning. I paused, letting the absolute magnitude of that statement sink in. I wanted him to feel the exact same overwhelming helplessness I felt 7 years ago when he threw my belongings into the street. I don't just own this restaurant, Winston, I said, locking eyes with him, ensuring he understood the absolute finality of his situation. I legally own you. I own your company. I own your warehouses. I own the luxury cars you leased under the company name. The moment you walk out of this restaurant, you have absolutely nothing left to your name except the cheap suit you are wearing." Camille let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. The aunts and uncles who had been snickering at me earlier were now staring at Winston in shocked silence, realizing the man they had idolized was a complete fraud. Kendrick, desperate to save his own inflated ego and prove he was still the alpha male in the room, suddenly stood up. He pointed a finger at me, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of bravado. "You think you're so smart," Kendrick yelled, his voice cracking slightly. "You think you can just buy some debt and act like you run the city. I am a senior vice president at Sterling Investment Bank. I will personally make sure your little VC firm is blacklisted from every major financial institution in Georgia. I will ruin your credit. I will ruin your company. You messed with the wrong man, Naomi." He stood there breathing heavily, looking incredibly proud of his threat, waiting for me to cower under his supposed banking power. He genuinely believed his corporate title made him untouchable. He believed he held the power to destroy me with a single phone call. I looked at Kendrick, completely unfazed by his outburst. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I just smiled, a cold, calculated smile that made his bravado falter instantly. I slowly reached back into my designer bag, preparing to drop the next devastating piece of evidence right into his lap. The destruction of Winston was only the first act. It was time to completely annihilate the arrogant banker who thought he could threaten me in my own house. I sat perfectly still, watching the digital clock on my phone screen silently tick down the seconds. The VIP room remained filled with the obnoxious sounds of my family gorging themselves. Kendrick was loudly chewing on a piece of Wagyu beef, bragging about a recent golf game. Jada was tapping away on her phone, filtering a photo of a crab leg to post online to show off her supposed wealth. Winston and Camille were discussing which country club they should join next summer to maximize their networking potential within the black elite of Atlanta. None of them noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere outside our private dining room. None of them realized the background music had been completely muted. Exactly 5 minutes after the waiter sprinted out of the room, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. But it was not a single waiter returning with a dessert menu or a leather checkbook for me to sign. It was 4 massive security guards dressed in immaculate, custom-tailored black suits. Their earpieces were curled tightly around their ears, and their expressions were carved from absolute stone. They moved into the room with military precision. They did not speak to my father. They did not acknowledge my mother. They marched straight to the dining table and physically began the confiscation. One guard smoothly reached over Kendrick's shoulder and pulled the remaining half-eaten piece of Wagyu beef right out from under his silver fork. Another guard stepped beside Winston, grabbed the $900 bottle of vintage champagne, and lifted it straight out of the silver ice bucket. The third and fourth guards efficiently gathered the expensive crystal glasses, taking them directly from the table, even the one my mother was currently reaching for. The table was stripped bare in a matter of seconds. The illusion of luxury they had been devouring was violently interrupted. Jada stood up so fast, her chair screeched harshly against the polished marble floor. She shrieked, her voice echoing off the paneled walls, demanding to know what these thugs thought they were doing. She screamed at the staff, reminding them that her husband was a top-tier investment banker and that they would all be fired immediately for treating the prestigious Caldwell family this way. She waved her 4-carat diamond ring in the face of the nearest guard, completely oblivious to the fact that he remained entirely unfazed by her outburst. He simply stacked 2 empty oyster plates and stepped back, his face a mask of professional indifference. Kendrick dropped his fork, his mouth hanging open in pure shock. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to use his banking status to intimidate the men in black suits, but his voice cracked as he demanded to see a manager. The guards remained absolutely silent, standing like a wall of solid muscle between my family and the door. They were not there to argue. They were there to execute my direct orders. The utter humiliation of having food physically taken away from them in a public setting, especially in a restaurant known for serving Atlanta's elite, paralyzed the rest of the extended family. My aunts and uncles sat frozen in their velvet chairs, their hands hovering awkwardly over the empty table. Camille slammed her hands flat on the table, Her face flushed a dark, furious red. She turned her burning gaze toward me, her eyes practically drilling holes into my skull. She yelled, her voice trembling with raw, unfiltered rage, asking why I was deliberately embarrassing them in front of high society. She accused me of setting up this humiliating spectacle because I was jealous of their success and bitter about my own pathetic life. She leaned across the empty table, her heavy diamond necklace swinging, and snarled, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "This is exactly why we kicked you out 7 years ago." Camille spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You have always been a ghetto, ungrateful embarrassment to the Caldwell name. We tried to give you a single chance to prove you belonged here today, and you do this. You have always been nothing but a parasite." Her cruel words hung heavily in the air, instantly bringing back the sharp, burning memory of the exact night they threw me away like trash. I was 25 years old at the time. I had just finished my master's degree in business administration. I was exhausted from years of non-stop studying, but I was incredibly proud because I was building a solid, actionable plan for a startup hospitality business. Winston had marched into my small bedroom that night and demanded I drop everything immediately. He told me his luxury logistics company was restructuring, and he needed me to step in and work as an unpaid operations manager to help the family maintain their wealthy image. When I politely refused, explaining I had my own investors lined up and my own business to build, the illusion of his paternal love shattered instantly. He exploded. He told me that my dreams were pathetic and worthless. He said no daughter of his was going to be a common cook serving people who were better than her. Camille had backed him up completely. While Winston screamed at me, Camille walked into my room with black garbage bags. She systematically packed my clothes, my books, and my laptop, and threw them out the front door onto the wet driveway. They left me completely homeless that night, forcing me to sleep in the back seat of my 20-year-old car for 3 agonizing weeks. I showered at cheap gyms and ate leftover bread from a local bakery just to survive, simply because I refused to be Winston's free, obedient labor. They cut me off without a second thought, changing the locks the very next morning to ensure I could never return. Now, 7 years later, Camille was using that exact same trauma, trying to weaponize my painful past, to break me down all over again. She wanted me to feel like that helpless, freezing 25-year-old girl crying in her car. But as I sat there in the luxurious VIP suite, watching my mother foam at the mouth over a confiscated glass of wine, I felt nothing but a deep, profound pity for her. She was a woman entirely consumed by the desperate need to project wealth, even when her actual soul was bankrupt. I looked at the security guards who were waiting patiently for my next command. I looked at Jada, whose mascara was beginning to smudge from her dramatic, performative tears. I looked at Kendrick, who was currently tapping frantically on his phone, likely trying to pull up his bank account balances to see if he could bribe the guards to leave. They were all scrambling, completely stripped of their dignity in a matter of moments. The power dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted, and they were completely unequipped to handle a reality where they were no longer the ones holding the leash. Camille continued to rant, her voice growing increasingly shrill as she demanded I call the police on myself for orchestrating this assault on their dining experience. She threatened to call her powerful friends to ruin my reputation in the city, to ensure no one would ever hire me to cater an event again. She was throwing every threat she had at the wall, hoping something would stick, desperately trying to regain the upper hand she believed she rightfully possessed. I let her scream. I let her exhaust herself in front of the silent, unmoving security team. I let the absolute silence of the room stretch out after her tirade finally ended, letting the humiliation of her outburst settle heavily over the family. The silence was deafening. It was the sound of a dynasty realizing they were no longer in control. The elegant crystal chandeliers above us seemed to mock their sudden lack of grace. For years I had believed that I was the problem. But seeing them now stripped of their fine dining and reduced to petty screaming adults, the truth was glaringly obvious. They used money as a weapon to cover their deep-seated insecurities. Camille panted, her chest heaving as she glared at me, waiting for me to apologize or beg for forgiveness. She expected me to break under the pressure of her societal threats. She expected me to cower just like I did when I was a child. Instead, I simply adjusted my posture, smoothing the fabric of my tailored suit. I did not flinch. This was not just about a dinner bill anymore. The trap they had set for me was merely a distraction for the real extortion they had planned for tonight. Winston, sensing that his wife's emotional outburst was failing to break my resolve, decided it was time to step in. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, cleared his throat, and completely dropped the loving father act he had been wearing all evening. Winston reached down beside his chair and lifted a heavy leather briefcase onto his lap. The polished brass locks clicked sharply in the quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, dropping them squarely in the center of the bare marble table. He placed a heavy gold pen right on top of the stack. His eyes were completely devoid of any warmth or paternal affection. The mask was entirely off. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and spoke with a cold, calculated authority. He told me that my grandmother had established a generational trust fund in my name. He reminded me that the trust officially unlocked today, exactly on my 32nd birthday. He said the family logistics business was currently experiencing a minor liquidity issue and required a sudden cash injection to maintain operations. He framed it as a temporary loan, but the paperwork clearly indicated a full transfer of assets. He demanded that I sign the entire trust fund over to his control immediately. He said it was my fundamental duty as a Caldwell to sacrifice my inheritance to ensure the family maintained their elite status in Atlanta. He claimed that since they had provided for me during my childhood, I owed them my absolute loyalty and my complete financial compliance. I stared at the thick stack of papers. The sheer audacity of his demand was staggering. They had summoned me here, ordered $12,000 worth of food on my dime, hurled vicious insults at my character, and now expected me to hand over millions of dollars to save a company they had explicitly banned me from entering. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I looked Winston dead in the eye and told him absolutely not. I said my grandmother left that money to me because she knew exactly how he mismanaged his own finances. I told him he would not see a single penny of my entire inheritance. The moment the refusal left my lips, Kendrick scoffed loudly. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned heavily across the table, trying to physically dominate the space between us. Kendrick had always fashioned himself as the ultimate alpha male. He was a senior investment banker who thrived on intimidation and aggressive negotiation tactics. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, as if my very presence offended his sensibilities. He told me I was making a truly massive mistake. He said I clearly did not understand how the real world operated outside of my tiny, insignificant kitchen. He cracked his knuckles, a deliberate show of physical strength, and smiled a predatory smile. He said he knew exactly what I had been up to lately. He claimed his elite banking connections gave him absolute access to everyone and everything in the city. He proudly announced that he already knew I was currently trying to secure a massive vendor contract with the Grandeur Hotel Group. He said he heard my little catering business was desperately trying to bid for their regional events and corporate retreats. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing register. He informed me that his prestigious investment bank was the primary financial underwriter for the entire Grandeur corporate expansion project happening in the Southeast. He boasted that he played golf with their chief executive officer every single weekend. He held up his hand, snapping his fingers in the air to demonstrate how easily he could control my fate. He declared that he personally held my entire professional future directly in the palm of his hand. Kendrick laid out his ultimatum with sickening glee. He told me to immediately pick up the heavy gold pen and sign the trust fund over to Winston without another word of complaint. If I obeyed, he promised to put in a good word for me and allow my little food cart business to win a small fraction of the hotel contract. But if I refused, he swore he would personally destroy me and my livelihood. He promised to make one phone call from his private office tomorrow morning and completely blacklist my name from every single corporate contract in the entire state of Georgia. He threatened to starve my business to death. He said he would ensure no reputable company would ever hire me to bake so much as a single cupcake for their events. He wanted me to absolutely know that my survival depended entirely on his mercy. Then Kendrick took his threat a step further. He decided to attack my gender and my independence. He pointed his finger right at my chest and told me to finally learn my proper place. He said I was acting too emotional and too arrogant for a woman who simply cooked food for a living. He told me to shut my mouth and truly know a woman's place when powerful men were handling real business. He said the black elite of Atlanta was run by men who commanded respect, and a stubborn, ungrateful daughter like me needed to bow her head and follow orders. He insulted my intelligence, claiming my business degree was completely useless because real generational wealth was built in boardrooms by men who understood high finance, not by women wearing aprons. Jada nodded vigorously beside him, completely supporting her husband's blatant toxic misogyny because it perfectly served her own selfish interests. She patted his arm, looking at him with absolute adoration, proud of how viciously he was trying to tear her own sister apart. I listened to every single word Kendrick said without breaking my eye contact. I did not shrink back in my chair. I did not let a single emotion cross my face. Internally, I was taking careful note of his massive, fragile ego. He was so incredibly confident in his banking title. He truly believed his position at the investment firm made him a god among men. He thought his professional connections were completely untouchable. He had absolutely no idea that the Grandeur Hotel Group contract he was holding over my head was not a simple vendor application for corporate catering. I had met with the Grandeur executives last month to discuss a complete buyout of their luxury dining sector. I was not merely trying to serve them food. I was actively trying to purchase their entire hospitality division outright. Furthermore, Kendrick's proud boast about his investment bank underwriting their expansion was the most amusing piece of information he could have possibly shared. He was waving a loaded gun around, completely unaware that he had absolutely no ammunition. He thought he was the hunter, but he was nothing more than blind prey, walking directly into a trap. I let his threats hang in the quiet air of the VIP suite. I let him bask in his own perceived glory. I wanted him to feel powerful. I wanted him to feel like he had completely cornered me. The higher he proudly placed himself on his imaginary pedestal, the harder his eventual fall would be. Winston smiled, a slow, greasy, satisfied curve of his lips. He tapped the legal document with his index finger. He told me that Kendrick was a very serious man who did not make idle threats. He warned me that I was currently playing a very dangerous game with my future. He said my catering business was undoubtedly struggling in this current economic climate, and I could not afford to make powerful enemies in the corporate sector. He spoke to me slowly, articulating his words as if he were trying to explain a simple concept to a remarkably slow child. He pushed the contract an inch closer to my specific side of the table, offering it to me like a lifeline instead of the financial death sentence it truly was. I kept my hands perfectly still. I did not look at the contract. I kept my gaze locked firmly on Kendrick. He was still leaning across the table, his chest puffed out, waiting for my inevitable submission. His expensive watch caught the light of the chandelier. He sneered, asking me if I had suddenly gone deaf, or if the reality of my impending failure had finally paralyzed my vocal cords. He told me the clock was ticking, and his patience was wearing dangerously thin. He demanded I acknowledge his authority and surrender to his demands. I took a deep breath, letting the absolute absurdity of their extortion attempt wash over me. They laid all their cards on the table. They exposed their greed, their misogyny, and their profound lack of basic human decency. They gave me every single reason I needed to destroy them, without a single ounce of guilt. The ambush they had meticulously planned reached its absolute peak. They thought they had secured their victory, but they were entirely wrong about absolutely everything. Winston stopped tapping the table. He slowly pulled his hands back and folded them neatly in his lap. The arrogant, booming voice he had been using all evening was suddenly gone. When he spoke again, his voice was tight, carefully controlled, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. He was a cornered animal, realizing the trap he had stepped into was of his own making. He asked me very quietly how long I had known about his company's financial situation. He asked how long I had been planning this public humiliation. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. I did not feel pity. I did not feel anger. I just felt a profound sense of closure. I told him I had known about his bankruptcy for 6 months. I explained that my venture capital firm had been tracking his luxury logistics company ever since he started defaulting on his offshore loans. I told him that buying his debt was not a personal vendetta. It was simply a highly profitable business acquisition. I bought his company because it was weak, vulnerable, and poorly managed, just like he was. I told him the fact that it was his company was merely an entertaining bonus. Camille let out a strangled sob. She reached across the table, her diamond bracelets clinking against the marble, trying to grab my hand. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into the sleeve of my blazer. She looked at me with wide, desperate eyes, the heavy makeup around her eyes beginning to smear from her tears. She begged me to listen to reason. She said we were family, that blood was thicker than water, and that I could not possibly let my own father lose everything he had built. She pleaded with me to tear up the debt acquisition paperwork. She promised that if I saved them tonight, they would welcome me back into the family with open arms. She swore they would give me a seat at the head of the table for every holiday, every gala, and every country club dinner for the rest of my life. I looked down at her hand gripping my sleeve. I did not pull away immediately. I let her hold on, letting her feel the absolute desperation of her own plea. Then I slowly, deliberately detached her fingers from my jacket. I told her that her definition of family was incredibly flawed. I reminded her that family does not throw their child into the street for refusing to be unpaid labor. Family does not order $12,000 worth of food and demand the person they believe is broke pay for it. I told her that offering me a seat at a table that I now owned was not a peace offering. It was a desperate attempt to maintain her own comfortable illusion. I told her I did not want her holidays, her galas, or her country club dinners. I told her I had built my own table, and absolutely none of them were invited to sit at it. Jada, who had been sitting in stunned silence since I revealed my ownership of the restaurant, suddenly stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing the attention of the security guards, who shifted slightly, preparing to intervene if she tried anything physical. Jada's face was pale, but her eyes were wild with a frantic, selfish energy. She ignored her father's bankruptcy. She ignored her mother's tears. She completely bypassed the fact that her husband's career was in jeopardy. Jada only cared about one thing: herself. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her diamond ring flashing aggressively under the chandelier. She demanded to know what this meant for her. She practically screamed, asking how she was supposed to maintain her lifestyle if Winston's company went under. She yelled that she had a $3 million mansion to pay for country club fees that were due next month and an entire social media image to uphold as Atlanta's premier black elite housewife. She blamed me for being selfish. She said she had done everything right. She said she gave the family an heir, married a top-tier banker, and played the perfect daughter role her entire life. She demanded to know what I had ever done besides run away and hide. She yelled that I owed them my financial support because they had to suffer the embarrassment of my sudden disappearance 7 years ago. I stared at Jada, absolutely mesmerized by the sheer depth of her delusion. Her entire world was collapsing around her. Her father was ruined, her mother was begging, and her husband was effectively unemployed, yet she was entirely focused on how she was going to pay for her next designer handbag. The golden child syndrome was so deeply ingrained in her psyche that she genuinely believed the universe revolved around her comfort. She truly believed I had an obligation to fund her superficial existence simply because she existed. I did not yell back. I did not argue with her twisted logic. I just sat there, letting her dig her grave deeper with every selfish word she screamed. I recorded every admission of her extortion, every display of her profound entitlement, permanently filing it away in my mind. I wanted her to completely exhaust herself, to run out of breath and excuses before I delivered the final fatal blow to her perfectly curated reality. When Jada finally stopped screaming, her chest heaving as she glared at me, the room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Even Kendrick, who was still trying to process the revelation about his bank, looked at his wife with a mixture of shock and mild disgust. He was beginning to realize that the woman he married was not a supportive partner, but a financial parasite who would happily let him sink as long as she kept her mansion. I reached into my designer bag for the final time. I pulled out a thick manila envelope. It was significantly heavier than the debt acquisition files I had shown Winston. I placed it gently on the marble table and slid it precisely toward Jada. It stopped right in front of her clenched fists. I told her that she was right about one thing. She had a $3 million mansion in Buckhead, and that mansion required a substantial amount of money to maintain. I told her she should open the envelope and see exactly how her maintenance plan was going. Jada hesitated, looking from the envelope to my face, sensing the trap, but unable to resist taking the bait. She snatched the envelope, ripped it open, and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. Her eyes scanned the first page, and I watched the exact moment her entire world stopped spinning. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like she might faint. Her hands began to shake violently, the papers rattling loudly in the quiet room. "What is this?" Jada whispered, her voice barely audible, completely devoid of the arrogant screaming from a minute ago. This. This is a foreclosure notice." I nodded slowly, a small, satisfied smile finally breaking through my cold facade. I told her that it was indeed a foreclosure notice. I explained that she and Kendrick had not made a single mortgage payment on their $3 million mansion in over 6 months. I told her that while they were busy hosting lavish dinner parties and posting photos of their luxury cars to maintain their elite image, they were secretly defaulting on every single loan they possessed. I revealed that my private equity firm did not just specialize in corporate debt. We also acquired distressed luxury real estate. I told Jada that her bank had quietly put her mansion up for auction last week, and my firm had purchased it entirely in cash. I did not just own her father's company. I legally owned the very roof over her head. I told her that the documents she was holding were not just a foreclosure notice. They were a legally binding 24-hour eviction mandate. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my folded hands, and delivered the line I had been waiting 7 years to say. "Pack your bags, sis," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the silent VIP suite. "Your entire aesthetic is officially homeless. You have exactly 24 hours to clear your designer garbage out of my new property before my security team throws it all onto the street, just like Camille did to me." Jada dropped the papers as if they were physically burning her hands. She collapsed back into her velvet chair, burying her face in her hands, completely shattered. Kendrick did not try to comfort her. He did not reach out to hold her hand. He was staring blankly at the wall, finally realizing the absolute totality of their destruction. Winston was still clutching the iPad, looking like a man who had just witnessed his own funeral. Camille was crying silently, her tears ruining her expensive makeup, finally understanding that her social standing in Atlanta was permanently, irreparably destroyed. The ambush they had planned had failed spectacularly. The $12,000 bill sitting on the table, the extortion contract, they tried to force me to sign, the cruel insults they hurled at my character. It had all been a desperate, pathetic attempt by a family of frauds trying to maintain an illusion that was already dead. They invited me here to humiliate me, but they only succeeded in providing the perfect stage for their own absolute annihilation. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my suit jacket. I looked down at the 14 family members sitting in stunned, broken silence. They were no longer the intimidating figures of my childhood. They were just small, sad, heavily indebted people who had played a terrible game and lost everything. I turned to the lead security guard and gave him a sharp nod. He stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding the room. "The dinner is officially over," I announced, my voice ringing with finality. "My security team will escort you off my property now. Do not ever attempt to contact me again. Do not ever try to use the Caldwell name to intimidate anyone in this city ever again. Because if you do, I will ensure every single newspaper and society blog in Atlanta receives a full copy of the debt portfolios and eviction notices currently sitting on this table." I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. I did not look back as the security guards moved in, firmly instructing my family to stand up and leave the premises. I did not listen to Camille's renewed sobbing or Winston's muttered curses. I walked out of the VIP suite, out of the restaurant I owned, and out into the warm, humid Atlanta night. The air tasted incredibly sweet. 7 years ago, I left my family with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and a broken heart. Tonight, I left them with nothing at all. I stepped into the back of my waiting, chauffeur-driven Maybach, feeling a profound, absolute peace. The ultimate revenge wasn't just destroying them, it was proving that I never needed them to build my empire in the first place. My light shined brightest the exact moment I cut their dead weight loose forever. Winston sat completely frozen in his tufted velvet chair. The arrogant smirk that had been permanently plastered across his face for the last 32 years slowly melted away, replaced by a mask of profound, unadulterated terror. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to issue another empty threat or demand an explanation, but no words came out. His vocal cords seemed entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the truth I had just dropped onto the dining table. The great patriarch of the Caldwell family, the man who had built his entire identity on projecting absolute power and untouchable wealth, was suddenly reduced to a trembling, speechless shell of a human being. The heavy mahogany doors of the VIP suite remained closed, guarded by my security team, sealing him inside the reality of his own making. Camille stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Her hands gripped the edge of the marble table so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. She looked dartingly around the room, expecting the general manager or the security guards to suddenly start laughing and declare this was all a massive, elaborate prank. But the guards remained standing by the doors like stone statues, their expressions completely neutral. The terrifying reality of the situation was finally beginning to penetrate her deep-seated delusions. She was sitting in a building owned by the very daughter she had maliciously thrown onto the streets. She swallowed hard, her expensive diamond necklace trembling against her chest as her breathing grew shallow and rapid. I did not give them a single moment to recover their breath. The destruction of their fake elite status had to be methodical, precise, and utterly ruthless. I reached into my designer bag and pulled out a slim silver iPad. I unlocked the screen and tapped a highly encrypted application folder. I slid the device across the polished wood directly toward Winston. It stopped right next to the $12,000 leather checkbook he had tried to use to humiliate me just 10 minutes ago. I leaned forward, resting my elbows gracefully on the table, and instructed Winston to look at the screen. I told him it was time we had a very honest, transparent conversation about the actual financial health of the Caldwell family dynasty. Winston hesitated. His hands were visibly shaking as he slowly reached out and pulled the iPad closer to him. He looked down at the bright screen, and I watched the exact second his entire world fractured. The screen displayed a highly detailed confidential financial audit of his precious luxury logistics company. It was the business he paraded around Atlanta, the company he used to secure his prestigious country club memberships, and the very same company he had demanded I drop out of school to serve as unpaid labor for. The graphs on the screen were not pointing upward. The numbers were not painted in the black ink of profitability. Every single metric, every quarterly report, and every cash flow projection was drowning in a sea of aggressive, catastrophic red ink. I spoke clearly, ensuring my voice carried to the aunts, uncles, and cousins sitting in stunned silence around the table. I announced that Winston Caldwell was not the brilliant business mogul he pretended to be. I told the room that his logistics company was not just failing, it was completely, irrevocably bankrupt. A collective gasp rippled through the extended family. My uncle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly looking at Winston with intense suspicion. My aunt whispered something panicked to her husband. The flawless facade of the Caldwell family was cracking right down the middle, exposing the rotting foundation underneath. I kept my eyes locked on Winston. I explained that I knew exactly how he had been funding his lavish lifestyle for the past 5 years. I detailed how he had been taking out massive predatory loans from shady offshore accounts with exorbitant interest rates. He was burning through borrowed cash just to maintain the illusion of black elite wealth. He was leasing expensive luxury cars under the company name, buying custom-tailored suits, and hosting extravagant parties using money he absolutely did not have. He was running a corporate Ponzi scheme built entirely on his own massive ego, borrowing from one lender to pay the interest on another, digging a financial grave so deep he could never possibly climb out. Camille finally found her voice. She stammered, her tone high-pitched and defensive, demanding to know how I had gained access to such highly confidential corporate documents. She accused me of hiring hackers, of corporate espionage, of committing federal crimes just to spite them. She shrieked that they would sue me for invading their privacy, desperately trying to cling to the illusion that they still possessed legal authority over me. I smiled a cold, calculated smile. I told Camille that I did not need to hack into anything. I explained that my primary business was not just hospitality or restaurant management. I revealed that the core of my empire, the engine that funded everything I owned, was a cutthroat venture capital and private equity firm. I told her that my firm specialized in identifying distressed, mismanaged companies and executing highly aggressive corporate takeovers. I watched the realization dawn on her face, the horror creeping into her eyes as she finally understood the magnitude of my success. I turned my attention back to my father. He was staring at the iPad, a single bead of sweat rolling down his forehead. I informed Winston that my analysts had been tracking his company's rapid decline for the past 8 months. We watched him default on payment after payment. We monitored every desperate move he made to keep his sinking ship afloat. And then I delivered the fatal blow. I told Winston that yesterday morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, my private equity firm had swooped in and bought out every single piece of his corporate debt from his creditors. We purchased his toxic loans for mere pennies on the dollar. Because his creditors knew his company was entirely worthless, they were thrilled to offload the risk to my firm. Winston looked up at me, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow and rapid. He croaked out a question asking what exactly that meant for him. I leaned back in my chair, reveling in the absolute power of the moment. I told him it meant that I was no longer just his estranged daughter. I was his primary sole creditor. I told him that the legal documents he had tried to force me to sign, earlier the ones demanding I hand over my grandmother's trust fund to save his business, were completely useless. His company did not need a minor cash injection. It needed a miracle, and I was the one holding the gavel. I stated the reality of his situation with brutal, uncompromising clarity. I told Winston that I legally owned his logistics company. I owned the massive warehouse facilities he operated out of. I owned the fleet of transport trucks sitting in his lots. I owned the lease agreements on the luxury vehicles he and Camille drove to this very restaurant tonight. I owned every single asset tied to the Caldwell business name. Winston slumped forward, gripping the edges of the marble table as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling into an abyss. How was a man who had spent his entire life obsessing over control, and now he had absolutely none? The daughter he had deemed unworthy, the daughter he had literally thrown out into the rain, now held the legal power to liquidate his entire existence with a single phone call to her asset management team. Jada, who had been sitting in terrified silence, suddenly slapped her hands over her face, realizing that the family money she relied on to supplement her own lavish lifestyle was entirely gone. Kendrick, the arrogant investment banker, stared at Winston with an expression of pure disgust, suddenly recognizing that he had tied himself to a family of financial frauds who could not even afford the seafood they had just consumed. I looked at the 14 people in the room. The atmosphere had completely shifted from toxic arrogance to suffocating despair. I reminded Winston of the $12,000 bill sitting on the table. I told him that since he no longer had a functioning company, and since his credit lines were now officially frozen under my firm's ownership review, he was going to have a very difficult time paying for the king crab he had just digested. I told my father that he had spent my entire childhood telling me I was a failure because I did not want to play his fake corporate games. I reminded him of the night he kicked me out when he screamed that I would never survive in the real world without his guidance and his money. I asked him how it felt to know that the very same daughter he discarded was the one who just legally repossessed his entire life's work. Winston could not answer. He just stared blankly at the iPad screen, reading the undeniable proof of his own destruction over and over again. The great patriarch of the Caldwell family was entirely broken. The fake elite facade was shattered, leaving nothing but a desperate, heavily indebted old man sitting in a restaurant he could no longer afford at the absolute mercy of the woman he had tried so hard to destroy. Winston sat completely frozen in his velvet chair. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered across his face for the last 32 years slowly melted away, replaced by a mask of unadulterated terror. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to issue another empty threat or demand an explanation, but no words came out. His vocal cords seemed paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the truth I had just dropped onto the dining table. The great patriarch of the Caldwell family, the man who had built his entire identity on projecting absolute power and untouchable wealth, was suddenly reduced to a trembling, speechless shell of a human being. The heavy mahogany doors of the VIP suite remained closed, guarded by my security team, sealing him inside the reality of his own making. Camille stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Her hands gripped the edge of the marble table so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. She looked dartingly around the room, expecting the general manager or the security guards to suddenly start laughing and declare this was all a massive, elaborate prank. But the guards remained standing by the doors like stone statues, their expressions completely neutral. The terrifying reality of the situation was finally beginning to penetrate her deep-seated delusions. She was sitting in a building owned by the very daughter she had maliciously thrown onto the streets. She swallowed hard, her expensive diamond necklace trembling against her chest as her breathing grew shallow and rapid. I did not give them a single moment to recover their breath. The destruction of their fake elite status had to be methodical, precise, and utterly ruthless. I reached into my designer bag and pulled out a slim silver iPad. I unlocked the screen and tapped a highly encrypted application folder. I slid the device across the polished wood directly toward Winston. It stopped right next to the $12,000 leather checkbook he had tried to use to humiliate me just 10 minutes ago. I leaned forward, resting my elbows gracefully on the table, and instructed Winston to look at the screen. I told him it was time we had a very honest, transparent conversation about the actual financial health of the Caldwell family dynasty. Winston hesitated. His hands were visibly shaking as he slowly reached out and pulled the iPad closer to him. He looked down at the bright screen, and I watched the exact second his entire world fractured. The screen displayed a highly detailed, confidential financial audit of his precious luxury logistics company. It was the business he paraded around Atlanta, the company he used to secure his prestigious country club memberships, and the same company he had demanded I drop out of school to serve as unpaid labor for. Every single metric, every quarterly report, and every cash flow projection was drowning in a sea of aggressive, catastrophic red ink. I spoke clearly, ensuring my voice carried to the aunts, uncles, and cousins sitting in stunned silence around the table. I announced that Winston Caldwell was not the brilliant business mogul he pretended to be. I told the room that his logistics company was not just failing, it was completely, irrevocably bankrupt. A collective gasp rippled through the extended family. My uncle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly looking at Winston with intense suspicion. My aunt whispered something panicked to her husband. The flawless facade of the Caldwell family was cracking right down the middle, exposing the rotting foundation underneath. I kept my eyes locked on Winston. I explained I knew exactly how he had funded his lavish lifestyle for 5 years. I detailed how he had taken out massive predatory loans from offshore accounts with exorbitant interest rates. He was burning through borrowed cash to maintain the illusion of black elite wealth. He was leasing luxury cars under the company name, buying custom suits, and hosting extravagant parties using money he did not have. He was running a corporate Ponzi scheme built on his ego, borrowing from one lender to pay another, digging a financial grave he could never escape. Camille finally found her voice. She stammered, her tone high-pitched and defensive, demanding to know how I had gained access to such highly confidential corporate documents. She accused me of hiring hackers, of corporate espionage, of committing federal crimes just to spite them. She shrieked that they would sue me for invading their privacy, desperately trying to cling to the illusion that they still possessed legal authority over me. I smiled, a cold, calculated smile. I told Camille that I did not need to hack into anything. I explained that my primary business was not just hospitality or restaurant management. I revealed that the core of my empire, the engine that funded everything I owned, was a cutthroat venture capital and private equity firm. I told her that my firm specialized in identifying distressed, mismanaged companies and executing highly aggressive corporate takeovers. I watched the realization dawn on her face, the horror creeping into her eyes as she finally understood the magnitude of my success. I turned my attention back to my father. He was staring at the iPad, a single bead of sweat rolling down his forehead. I informed Winston that my analysts had been tracking his company's rapid decline for 8 months. We watched him default on payment after payment. We monitored every desperate move he made to keep his sinking ship afloat. Then I delivered the fatal blow. I told Winston that yesterday morning, my private equity firm swooped in and bought out every single piece of his corporate debt. We purchased his toxic loans for mere pennies on the dollar. Because his creditors knew his company was entirely worthless, they were thrilled to offload the risk to my firm. Winston looked up at me, his eyes wide, his breathing shallow and rapid. He croaked out a question asking what exactly that meant for him. I leaned back in my chair, reveling in the absolute power of the moment. I told him it meant that I was no longer just his estranged daughter. I was his primary sole creditor. I told him that the legal documents he had tried to force me to sign earlier, the ones demanding I hand over my grandmother's trust fund to save his business, were completely useless. His company did not need a minor cash injection. It needed a miracle, and I was the one holding the gavel. I leaned forward, making sure he felt the full weight of my words. He was completely trapped. I stated the reality of his situation with brutal, uncompromising clarity. I told Winston that I legally owned his logistics company. I owned the massive warehouse facilities he operated out of. I owned the fleet of transport trucks sitting in his lots. I owned the lease agreements on the luxury vehicles he and Camille drove to this very restaurant tonight. I owned every single asset tied to the Caldwell business name. Winston slumped forward, gripping the edges of the marble table, as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling into an abyss. How was a man who had spent his entire life obsessing over control, and now he had absolutely none? The daughter he had deemed unworthy now held the legal power to liquidate his entire existence with a single phone call. Jada, sitting in terrified silence, suddenly slapped her hands over her face, realizing the family money she relied on to supplement her lavish lifestyle was entirely gone. Kendrick stared at Winston with an expression of pure disgust, suddenly recognizing he had tied himself to a family of financial frauds who could not even afford the seafood they had just consumed. I looked at the 14 people in the room. The atmosphere had completely shifted from toxic arrogance to suffocating despair. I reminded Winston of the $12,000 bill. I told him that since he no longer had a functioning company, and his credit lines were officially frozen under my ownership review, he was going to have a very difficult time paying for the king crab. I told my father he had spent my childhood calling me a failure because I refused to play his fake corporate games. I reminded him of the night he kicked me out, screaming that I would never survive without his guidance. I asked him how it felt to know the daughter he discarded just legally repossessed his entire life's work. Winston could not answer. He just stared blankly at the iPad screen, reading the proof of his destruction. The great patriarch of the Caldwell family was entirely broken. The elite facade was shattered, leaving nothing but a desperate, heavily indebted old man sitting in a restaurant he could no longer afford, at the absolute mercy of the woman he tried to destroy. He had absolutely no power left to wield against me or anyone else in this room. Winston's devastating silence stretched across the long dining table. He was a man completely broken by the very reality he had tried so hard to deny. He had lost his entire company, his pristine reputation, and his precious position in the Atlanta Black elite. The realization that I, the daughter he threw away, now legally owned every single facet of his life had paralyzed him completely. He stared at the iPad screen, his breathing shallow and rapid, unable to look me in the eye. He was a defeated king sitting in a ruined castle, and I was holding the keys to the gate. Kendrick, however, was a completely different breed of narcissist. He was an arrogant investment banker who thrived on intimidation and aggressive negotiation tactics. He could not handle the shift in power. He refused to accept that a woman he deemed beneath him was currently dominating the entire room. He unbuttoned his custom-tailored suit jacket, puffed out his chest, and leaned aggressively across the table, trying to physically dominate the space between us. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, as if my very presence deeply offended his sensibilities. He pointed a thick finger directly at my face, a desperate attempt to reassert his crumbling authority. He yelled that I was making a truly massive career-ending mistake. He said I clearly did not understand how the real corporate world operated outside of my insignificant kitchen. He cracked his knuckles, a deliberate theatrical show of physical strength, and smiled a predatory, vicious smile. He told me he knew exactly what I had been up to lately. He claimed his elite banking connections gave him absolute unrestricted access to everyone and everything in the city. He proudly announced that he already knew I was currently trying to secure a massive vendor contract with the Grandeur Hotel Group. He said he heard my little catering business was desperately trying to bid for their regional events and corporate retreats. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing, threatening register. He informed me that his prestigious investment bank was the primary financial underwriter for the entire Grandeur corporate expansion project happening in the Southeast. He boasted that he played golf with their chief executive officer every single weekend. He held up his hand, snapping his fingers loudly in the air to demonstrate how easily he could control my fate. He declared that he personally held my entire professional future directly in the palm of his hand. Kendrick laid out his ultimatum with sickening glee. He told me to immediately pick up the heavy gold pen Winston had left on the table and sign the trust fund over to my father without another word of complaint. If I obeyed his command, he promised to put in a good word for me and allow my little food cart business to win a small fraction of the hotel contract. But if I refused, he swore he would personally destroy me and my entire livelihood. He promised to make one phone call from his private office tomorrow morning and completely blacklist my name from every single corporate contract in the entire state of Georgia. He threatened to starve my business to death. He said he would ensure no reputable company would ever hire me to bake so much as a single cupcake for their events. He wanted me to absolutely know that my survival depended entirely on his mercy. Then Kendrick took his threat a step further. He decided to viciously attack my gender and my independence. He told me to finally learn my proper place in society. He said I was acting too emotional and too arrogant for a woman who simply cooked food for a living. He told me to shut my mouth and truly know a woman's place when powerful men were handling real business. He said the black elite of Atlanta was run by men who commanded respect, and a stubborn, ungrateful daughter like me needed to bow her head and follow orders. He insulted my intelligence, claiming my business degree was completely useless because real generational wealth was built in boardrooms by men who understood high finance, not by women wearing aprons. Jada nodded vigorously beside him, completely supporting her husband's blatant toxic misogyny because it perfectly served her own selfish interests. She patted his arm, looking at him with absolute adoration, incredibly proud of how viciously he was trying to tear her own sister apart. She truly believed her husband was the most powerful man in the room. I listened to every single word Kendrick said without breaking my eye contact. I did not shrink back in my chair. I did not let a single emotion cross my face. Internally, I was taking careful, precise note of his massive, fragile ego. He was so incredibly confident in his banking title. He truly believed his position at the investment firm made him a god among men. He thought his professional connections were completely untouchable. He had absolutely no idea that the Grandeur Hotel Group contract he was holding over my head was not a simple vendor application for corporate catering. I had met with the Grandeur executives last month to discuss a complete buyout of their luxury dining sector. I was not merely trying to serve them food. I was actively trying to purchase their entire hospitality division outright. Furthermore, Kendrick's proud boast about his investment bank underwriting their expansion was the most amusing piece of information he could have possibly shared. He was waving a loaded gun around, completely unaware that he had absolutely no ammunition. He thought he was the apex predator, but he was nothing more than blind prey, walking directly into a trap. I let his threats hang in the quiet air of the VIP suite. I let him bask in his own perceived glory. I wanted him to feel powerful. I wanted him to feel like he had completely cornered me. The higher he proudly placed himself on his imaginary pedestal, the harder his eventual spectacular fall would be. I reached into my designer bag for the third time tonight. I did not pull out a credit card or an iPad. I pulled out a single perfectly folded piece of premium cardstock. It was an official letter printed on the heavy embossed letterhead of his very own prestigious investment bank. I placed it gently on the marble table and slid it precisely toward him. It stopped right next to his empty champagne glass. I told him he should read it carefully as it directly pertained to his highly esteemed corporate connections. Kendrick snatched the paper, his arrogant smirk still firmly in place. He unfolded it with a quick, dismissive flick of his wrist. His eyes scanned the first few lines. I watched the exact moment his towering ego completely shattered. His jaw dropped. His hands began to shake violently, making the thick paper rattle loudly in the dead silence of the room. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like he might pass out. "What? What is this?" Kendrick stammered, his voice weak and raspy, completely devoid of the booming authority he had used just a minute ago. "That is an official notice of termination from the board of directors," I said, my voice echoing clearly. "And a formal notification of a hostile takeover. Your firm isn't underwriting the grandeur expansion anymore, Kendrick. My venture capital firm is currently leading a total acquisition of your bank." Kendrick stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He could not comprehend the words I was saying. He could not process that the woman he had just violently insulted was the one executing a hostile takeover of his entire career. "You said you play golf with the CEO every weekend." I continued, leaning forward to ensure he heard every single syllable. "Well, I had a meeting with your CEO at 2 o'clock this afternoon. I personally audited your entire investment portfolio. I exposed the massive, catastrophic financial losses you have been hiding in offshore shell accounts for the past 3 years. You have been hemorrhaging millions of dollars of client money, Kendrick, and covering it up with fake quarterly reports." Jada gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. She looked at her husband, realizing the luxurious lifestyle he provided was built entirely on corporate fraud. Kendrick tried to speak, tried to formulate a defense, but I cut him off immediately. "I presented the audit to the board of directors," I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. "They voted unanimously to terminate your employment immediately. You were officially fired at 3:30 this afternoon. You just don't know it yet, because your corporate access card was deactivated while you were sitting here eating crab legs." The silence in the VIP suite was deafening. The arrogant, toxic banker who had just threatened to destroy my life was completely ruined. He was officially unemployed, disgraced, and likely facing federal investigation for his fraudulent investments. He had tried to use his corporate power to crush me, but I had already dismantled his entire career before the dinner even started. I had successfully checkmated the most arrogant man in Atlanta, and I did not even break a sweat. He sat there staring at the termination letter, his entire identity as a powerful black elite banker completely erased. He sat there staring at the termination letter, his entire identity as a powerful black elite banker completely erased. The heavy silence in the VIP suite was suddenly shattered by a sharp, panicked gasp from the seat right next to him. Jada had been leaning over his shoulder, her eyes frantically scanning the official embossed letterhead from the board of directors. The reality of the words printed on that page finally penetrated her thick skull. She snatched the paper right out of her husband's trembling hands, bringing it inches from her face as if getting closer to the text would somehow change the catastrophic meaning. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug into the crisp cardstock, wrinkling the pristine edges. Jada let out a sound that was half shriek and half sob. She turned violently toward Kendrick, her eyes wide with a frantic, selfish terror. She did not ask if he was okay. She did not ask how they would navigate this devastating career loss together as a married couple. She immediately launched into a vicious, hysterical interrogation about how this termination would impact her personal lifestyle. She screamed at him, demanding to know how he could be so incredibly stupid to get caught hiding financial losses. She yelled that her exclusive country club membership dues were required by the end of the month. She demanded to know how she was supposed to show her face at the upcoming charity galas if her husband was suddenly a disgraced, unemployed fraud facing federal investigation. Kendrick just stared blankly ahead, completely unresponsive to her escalating hysteria. His jaw was slack, his chest rising and falling in shallow, defeated breaths. He was a man who had just watched his entire kingdom burn to the ground in less than 5 minutes, and he had absolutely no fight left in him. He ignored his wife's shrieking, entirely realizing in that exact moment that Jada had never loved him for who he was. She only loved the prestigious title on his business card and the limitless black credit card he used to fund her performative existence. Failing to get a response from her broken husband, Jada whipped her head around and locked her furious gaze on me. Her chest was heaving, her designer silk blouse rising and falling rapidly as she started hyperventilating. The foundation of her perfect curated life was collapsing all around her. Her father was bankrupt. Her husband was fired. But the deep-seated entitlement of the golden child syndrome refused to let her admit defeat. She desperately needed to find a way to remain superior to the sister she had spent her entire life stepping on. She needed a lifeline to cling to, something to prove that she was still the ultimate winner in the Caldwell family dynamic. Jada stood up, planting her hands firmly on the bare marble table. She looked at me with a desperate, wild superiority. She jutted her chin out and loudly declared that she did not care what happened to Winston's failing logistics company. She coldly stated that she did not care if Kendrick ruined his own banking career through his own sheer incompetence. She loudly proclaimed that their financial failures had absolutely nothing to do with her personal success. She pointed a shaking finger at her own chest and proudly announced that she was still untouchable. She reminded the entire room that she still possessed her magnificent $3 million mansion right in the heart of Buckhead. She bragged about her sweeping grand staircase, her imported Italian marble countertops, and her pristine Olympic-sized swimming pool. She mocked my simple tailored black suit, telling me that no matter how many companies I secretly bought, I would never possess her flawless aesthetic or her high society grace. She claimed her real estate asset alone made her a queen in Atlanta, completely immune to the destruction happening at this dinner table. She demanded I sign the trust fund papers anyway, screaming that she needed my inheritance to properly maintain her luxury lifestyle now that the men in the family had proven to be completely useless. She blamed me for being entirely selfish, screaming that she had given this family a beautiful heir and secured their social status by marrying well. She yelled that I owed her my financial support because I had done absolutely nothing for this family but caused them stress and embarrassment. I sat perfectly still, observing her intense, spectacular delusion. The sheer magnitude of her narcissism was honestly fascinating to witness. Her entire world was imploding, yet she was entirely focused on preserving her superficial image. She genuinely believed she could verbally bully a billionaire into funding her designer wardrobe. She believed her custom-built mansion was an impenetrable fortress that would keep her safe from the consequences of her own financial reality. I let her scream. I let her brag about her expensive interior design and her lavish neighborhood. I wanted her to firmly stake her entire identity on that single piece of real estate. I recorded every single admission of her toxic entitlement in my mind, waiting patiently for her to completely run out of breath. When Jada finally stopped yelling, panting heavily, as she glared at me across the large table, the room fell back into a suffocating, heavy silence. The extended family members were staring at her in sheer horror, realizing how quickly she had turned on her own father and husband to save her own skin. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her twisted, selfish logic. I simply reached into my designer bag for the very last time tonight. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I placed it gently on the polished marble table. The dull thud of the paper hitting the surface echoed sharply in the quiet room. I placed my hand flat on top of the folder and looked directly into Jada's wild, panicked eyes. I told her that she was absolutely right about one specific thing. She did live in a stunning $3 million mansion in Buckhead. I agreed that the imported Italian marble countertops were indeed beautiful, and the grand staircase was incredibly photogenic for her daily social media posts. I told her it was a truly magnificent property that required a massive amount of capital to properly maintain. I slid the heavy manila folder across the smooth marble surface. It glided perfectly, stopping right at the edge of the table, inches away from Jada's clenched fists. I told her she should open the folder and see exactly how her luxury maintenance plan was progressing. Jada hesitated. She looked down at the plain brown envelope, sensing the fatal trap waiting inside, but her arrogant curiosity made it impossible for her to resist. She snatched the folder off the table and ripped the protective seal open. She pulled out a thick stack of formal notarized legal documents. Her eyes darted across the bold black text at the very top of the first page. I watched the exact millisecond her entire reality completely shattered. The remaining color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. Her hands began to shake violently, making the thick legal paper rattle loudly in the dead silence of the VIP suite. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I did not wait for her to find her voice. I broke the silence for her. I announced to the room that the document Jada was shakingly holding was an official finalized notice of foreclosure. I explained the brutal financial truth she had been desperately hiding from the world. I told the room that while Jada and Kendrick were busy hosting lavish catered dinner parties and posting heavily filtered photos of their luxury vehicles to maintain their fake elite image, they were secretly defaulting on every single loan they possessed. I revealed that they had not made a single mortgage payment on their precious $3 million mansion in over 6 months. They were drowning in debt, living entirely on borrowed time and maxed out credit lines. The bank had officially seized their property 30 days ago. I leaned forward, making sure she heard every single syllable of her destruction. I told Jada that my private equity firm did not just specialize in hostile corporate takeovers. We also had a highly profitable division dedicated entirely to acquiring distressed luxury real estate from major banks. I told her that her specific bank had quietly put her Buckhead mansion up for private auction last week. I smiled a cold, victorious smile. I informed my sister that my firm had purchased her distressed property entirely in cash. I did not just own Winston's logistics company. I legally owned the very roof over Jada's head. I held the sole exclusive deed to her immaculate mansion. I told her that the documents she was holding were not just a standard foreclosure notice. They included a legally binding court-ordered 24-hour eviction mandate. I looked at the woman who had tormented me my entire life, the golden child who thought she was infinitely better than the sister she helped throw into the streets. I delivered the fatal blow with absolute icy precision. "Pack your bags, sis," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. "Your aesthetic is officially homeless." Jada dropped the heavy legal documents as if the paper was physically burning her skin. The pages scattered across the marble table, mixing with the empty oyster shells and the crumpled cloth napkins. She collapsed back into her velvet chair, burying her face in her trembling hands. She let out a loud, agonizing wail that sounded like a wounded animal. Her entire identity, built purely on zip codes and square footage, was completely eradicated. She had absolutely nothing left to brag about. She had no home to return to. She was officially a squatter in a property owned by the sister she despised. Kendrick did not turn to look at her. He did not reach out to comfort his sobbing wife. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the wall, completely paralyzed by his own career destruction, realizing that his marriage was just another failed toxic investment. Winston sat with his head bowed, unable to summon the energy to defend his favorite daughter. Camille was weeping openly now, the realization of their total, comprehensive ruin finally sinking in. The ambush they had meticulously planned had failed in the most spectacular way possible. They had tried to trap me with a restaurant bill, but I had successfully evicted them from the very concept of the Atlanta Black elite. The destruction was absolute. For a long moment, the only sound in the VIP suite of the Onyx Room was the ragged, uneven breathing of the people who had once thought they were untouchable gods. Jada was still slumped in her chair, staring blankly at the eviction notice, her mind completely unable to process a reality where she was not the wealthiest woman in the room. Kendrick was a hollow shell, his arrogance entirely evaporated by his termination. Winston looked like a man standing on the gallows, fully aware that the trapdoor was about to swing open beneath his expensive leather shoes. Then the silence was shattered by a high-pitched, desperate wail. Camille could no longer maintain her polished country club facade. The realization that she was losing her husband's company, her daughter's mansion, and her entire social standing in the black elite of Atlanta finally broke her completely. She stood up, her legs trembling so badly that she had to grip the edge of the marble table just to keep from collapsing onto the floor. Tears were streaming down her face in thick, dark rivers, completely ruining her flawless designer makeup. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. She did not look like the cruel, condescending matriarch who had demanded I pay a $12,000 initiation fee just an hour ago. She looked like a beggar. "Naomi, please," Camille cried, her voice cracking as a loud, ugly sob tore from her throat. "Please stop this. You have made your point. You have proven you are powerful. But you cannot do this to us. You cannot take away everything we have built." She rounded the table, stumbling slightly in her expensive heels. She reached out her hands, shaking violently, attempting to grab my hands. I leaned back, ensuring she could not touch me. She let out another hysterical sob, clasping her hands together against her chest, as if she were praying to me. "We are your family, Naomi." Camille pleaded, her voice echoing loudly in the tense room. "We are your blood. You came from me. You cannot destroy your own flesh and blood over some bad investments. We just made some poor financial choices, that is all. We were trying to keep the Caldwell name respectable. We were trying to build a legacy for all of us. You have to forgive us. You have to tear up those foreclosure papers and cancel the debt acquisition. We are blood." She turned her tear-stained face toward the aunts and uncles who were still sitting frozen in their chairs. She desperately tried to rally them to her side, begging them to intervene, begging them to remind me of the importance of family loyalty. But they all physically recoiled from her. My Aunt Valerie looked away, suddenly deeply interested in the pattern of the wallpaper. My uncle averted his eyes. They had watched me systematically dismantle Winston, Kendrick, and Jada with terrifying precision. They knew that if they dared to speak a single word in Camille's defense, I would immediately turn my crosshairs on them and uncover whatever financial skeletons they were hiding in their own closets. They abandoned Camille just as quickly as she had abandoned me 7 years ago. Camille turned back to me, her chest heaving. "Please, Naomi, have some mercy. We are blood." I looked at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel the sudden urge to forgive. I simply felt tired of her endless manipulative lies. "Do not dare use that word with me," I said, my voice dangerously calm and sharp enough to cut glass. "Do not dare talk to me about blood and family. Where was your loyalty to your blood 7 years ago when you packed my clothes in garbage bags and threw me out into the rain? Where was your mercy when I was sleeping in the back of a freezing car wondering how I was going to buy my next meal? You did not care about blood then. You only care about blood now because your bank accounts are empty and you are terrified of losing your country club memberships." Camille let out a strangled gasp, stepping back as if my words had physically struck her. She shook her head rapidly, trying to formulate another excuse, trying to downplay the horrific financial mess Winston had created. "It was just some bad investments, Naomi," she cried, desperately clinging to that narrative. "Your father just got bad advice. We were trying to survive in a very competitive circle. It is just money. You cannot ruin our lives over money." I stood up, slowly pushing my chair back. I looked from Camille to Winston and then to Kendrick. I decided it was time to drop the final, heaviest curtain on their pathetic stage play. "Bad investments," I repeated, letting out a short, humorless laugh. "You think I bought Winston's corporate debt and foreclosed on Jada's mansion just because you made some poor stock choices? You think this entire night was just about me proving I have more money than you?" I reached into my designer bag one last time. I did not pull out an iPad or a foreclosure notice. I pulled out a thick sealed document bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. I placed it squarely on the center of the table. The heavy thud of the document seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the room. Winston's head snapped up. His eyes locked onto the government seal and all the blood left his face. He looked like he was about to have a heart attack right there in his tufted chair. Kendrick suddenly stopped breathing, his entire body going rigid with an entirely new, deeply profound level of absolute terror. "Let us talk about the real reason you invited me here tonight," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "Let us talk about why Winston and Kendrick were so incredibly desperate to get my signature on that trust fund transfer document. It was never about saving the logistics company. The company has been dead for years. And it was never about getting a minor cash injection to float your lifestyle." I pointed directly at my father. He shrank back into his seat, his hands trembling violently in his lap. 7 years ago. I continued making sure the extended family heard every single word of this criminal revelation. Right before you kicked me out of the house to supposedly teach me a lesson, you did something else. You realized your company was already failing. You realized your country club dues were bouncing. So you and Kendrick sat down in your home office and you committed massive systematic identity theft. Camille gasped loudly, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Jada looked up from her eviction and noticed her tear-filled eyes darting between her husband and her father in sheer confusion. "You took my social security number," I stated, my voice echoing like a judge reading a final verdict. "You used my clean, unblemished financial record as a 25-year-old student to secure millions of dollars in highly illegal, fraudulent offshore loans. You funneled that stolen money through a complex web of shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. You used my name, my identity, and my future to fund your lavish lifestyle, your luxury cars, and your fake black elite image." The collective shock in the room was palpable. My aunts and uncles were staring at Winston in absolute horror. It was one thing to be a bad businessman. It was an entirely different thing to be a ruthless criminal who stole his own daughter's identity to fund his massive ego. Kendrick tried to stand up his chair, scraping loudly. "You cannot prove that," he stammered, his voice cracking with pure panic. "You have no proof of those offshore accounts." "I own the venture capital firm that just bought your debt, Kendrick," I reminded him coldly. "I have a team of forensic accountants who spent the last 3 months tearing apart every single ledger, every single wire transfer, and every single digital signature you two fools tried to hide. I have the IP addresses you used. I have the fake corporate emails. I have absolutely everything." I tapped the thick Department of Justice document resting on the marble table. "But more importantly," I said, "the Federal Bureau of Investigation has everything. They have been investigating this massive wire fraud and identity theft ring for the past 6 weeks. They have been quietly building a federal indictment that carries a minimum sentence of 20 years in federal prison." Winston let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He clutched his chest, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. He knew it was over. There was no buying his way out of a federal indictment, especially when his bank accounts were entirely empty. I looked at the legal document Winston had tried to force me to sign at the beginning of the dinner. The one he claimed was just a simple transfer of my grandmother's trust fund to help the family. "That is why you needed me here tonight," I revealed, exposing the absolute darkest, most evil piece of their entire plot. That contract was not a simple asset transfer. My legal team reviewed the hidden clauses buried on page 47. If I had picked up that gold pen and signed that document, I would have legally assumed all historical debt, all corporate liability, and all fiduciary responsibility for those offshore shell companies. You invited me to a $12,000 dinner so you could legally shift the blame for your federal crimes onto my shoulders. You were going to let me go to federal prison so you could keep playing golf. Camille screamed, a loud, piercing sound of absolute denial. She looked at her husband, realizing that the man she had worshipped for his wealth was actually a monster who was perfectly willing to send his youngest daughter to a federal penitentiary just to save his own skin. "You are a monster, Winston," I said softly, but my words cut deeper than any shout ever could. "You both are. You thought I was just a naive, struggling caterer who would be so desperate for your love and validation that I would sign anything you put in front of me. You thought you could sacrifice me to the federal government and walk away clean." I picked up my designer bag and adjusted the strap on my shoulder. The total destruction was finally complete. I had stripped them of their wealth, their homes, their careers, and their freedom. There was absolutely nothing left for them to hide behind. "I refused to be your sacrifice 7 years ago," I said, looking at the broken, sobbing ruins of my family. "And I absolutely refuse to be your scapegoat tonight. The FBI is not just investigating you anymore, they have finalized the arrest warrants." Right on cue, as if the universe itself was applauding the exact timing of my revelation, the flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers reflected brightly through the tinted front windows of the Onyx Room. The sirens wailed loudly outside, cutting sharply through the upscale, quiet atmosphere of Buckhead. Kendrick looked toward the windows, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. Winston slumped forward onto the table, completely surrendering to his inevitable fate. The trap they had so carefully laid for me had become the very cage that would lock them away for the rest of their miserable lives. The game was permanently over, and I had unquestionably won. The flashing red and blue lights painted the heavy mahogany walls of the VIP suite in violent rhythmic strokes. The alternating colors reflected directly off the imported crystal chandeliers and bounced onto the terrified faces of my family. The wail of the sirens grew deafeningly loud before abruptly cutting off right outside the main entrance of the Onyx room. The silence that followed the sirens was far more terrifying than the noise itself. It was the sound of impending federal custody. My aunts and uncles immediately scrambled backward. They pushed their velvet chairs away from the dining table with such frantic force that several tipped over and crashed onto the marble floor. They wanted absolutely no physical proximity to Winston or Kendrick. The unspoken rule of Atlanta high society is self-preservation above all else. They were perfectly willing to eat $12,000 worth of free Wagyu beef, but they were absolutely unwilling to be caught in the splash zone of a federal wire fraud indictment. They huddled in the far corners of the room, clutching their designer bags and staring at my father as if he were highly contagious. Kendrick was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his custom-tailored suit. The reality of his situation had finally bypassed his massive, arrogant ego and struck him right in his core. He was not just an unemployed banker anymore. He was a criminal facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The elite country clubs, the $3 million mansion, the flashy sports cars were all gone. He looked at me sitting calmly at the end of the table. He saw my perfectly neutral expression and he completely snapped. "You did this to me," Kendrick roared, his voice cracking with pure primal desperation. He planted his hands on the marble table and violently launched himself forward. He kicked his chair back and scrambled over the empty oyster platters and spilled ice buckets, lunging directly across the long table toward me. He reached out with his large hands, his face contorted in absolute rage, fully intending to grab me by my throat. He wanted to physically hurt me for destroying his fraudulent empire. I did not even make it halfway across the table. The four massive security guards I had stationed inside the room reacted with terrifying, brutal efficiency. They did not shout warnings. They did not hesitate. Before Kendrick could bring his fingers anywhere near my tailored suit, two guards lunged forward and intercepted him mid-air. They grabbed him by his expensive suit jacket and violently yanked him backward. They slammed him face first into the hard marble floor with a sickening thud. The impact echoed sharply through the room. Kendrick let out a muffled groan of pain as the guards immediately pinned his arms behind his back. A third guard planted a heavy tactical boot firmly between his shoulder blades, pressing him flat against the ground. His cheek was smashed against the cold floor, right next to a dropped piece of crab meat. The alpha male investment banker who had threatened to destroy my entire career just 20 minutes ago was now hopelessly pinned to the floor, completely neutralized and utterly humiliated. Jada let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She dropped to her knees, reaching out toward her husband, but the fourth security guard stepped directly in her path, raising a single hand to halt her progress. She hit an invisible wall of authority and crumbled onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Her perfect blowout was ruined, her designer silk blouse was wrinkled, and her entire life was in absolute ruins. Winston did not move to help his son-in-law. He did not even look at Kendrick pinned to the floor. My father was entirely consumed by his own impending doom. He gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles white, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He looked at the flashing police lights illuminating the window, then looked back at me. His eyes were wide with a frantic, begging desperation. "Naomi," Winston gasped, his voice trembling so badly he could barely form the words. "You have to tell them it was a misunderstanding. You have to tell the federal agents that we were just moving family money around. I am your father. You cannot let them put me in handcuffs. I will not survive in federal prison. I am a respected man." Camille crawled across the floor, abandoning any remaining shred of her country club dignity. She grabbed the hem of my pants, her tears soaking into the fabric. She begged me to call off the police. She swore she would do anything I wanted. She promised she would publicly apologize to me in front of the entire city. She claimed she would sign over whatever was left of their belongings if I just made the flashing lights go away. I looked down at her hands gripping my clothes. I felt a fleeting rush of disgust. They were not sorry for stealing my identity. They were not sorry for kicking me out into the rain 7 years ago. They were only sorry that they had finally been caught. They only regretted the fact that I was the one holding the evidence. I stood up and smoothly pulled my leg back, forcing Camille to release her grip on my suit. I adjusted my jacket and turned my attention away from my sobbing parents. I looked toward the heavy double doors of the VIP suite, which were now being held open by my general manager. Standing in the hallway, illuminated by the warm restaurant lighting, was my lead corporate attorney, Marcus. He was flanked by 3 other members of my legal team. They looked immaculate professional and completely ready to execute the final phase of my strategy. I reached into my designer bag for the absolute last time tonight. I bypassed my wallet and my phone, my fingers wrapped around a small, sleek, encrypted metal flash drive. I pulled it out and held it up so the ambient light caught its silver surface. The entire room fell deadly silent. Even Jada stopped her hysterical sobbing to stare at the small device in my hand. They all knew exactly what it was. "This is the culmination of 3 months of exhaustive forensic accounting," I announced, making sure my voice carried over the sound of the sirens outside. I looked directly at Winston, who was staring at the flash drive with sheer, unadulterated horror. "Inside this drive is the complete, undeniable digital footprint of your identity theft. It contains every single fraudulent signature, every offshore wire transfer receipt, and every fake corporate email you used to secure those loans in my name. It traces every single stolen dollar directly back to your personal accounts." I walked over to the doorway and handed the metal flash drive directly to Marcus. He took it with a firm nod, slipping it securely into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. "I did not just invite my legal team to the restaurant tonight to review a trust fund contract," I told my family, turning back to face them. "I invited the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They have been waiting patiently outside the Onyx Room for the last 20 minutes, securing the perimeter to ensure no one attempts to flee the premises. They are currently liaising with the Atlanta Police Department to execute the arrest warrants we finalized this morning." I pointed a steady finger toward the tinted front windows of the restaurant, where the red and blue lights continued to flash aggressively against the glass. "I want you to look at those lights, Winston," I commanded. "I want you to look at them and realize that your era of manipulating this family is permanently over. You thought you could use me as your ultimate scapegoat. You thought you could legally shift the criminal liability of your massive fraud onto my shoulders and walk away a free man. You brought me here to sacrifice my freedom for your fake luxury lifestyle." I stepped closer to the table, looking down at my father. "But you severely underestimated the woman I became after you threw me away. You created a survivor, Winston, and tonight the survivor just handed you over to the feds." The sound of heavy, authoritative footsteps echoed loudly from the main dining room hallway. The federal agents had entered the building. They were marching purposefully toward the VIP suite, their radios crackling with static. The trap had officially sprung shut, and the steel jaws were closing tightly around the Caldwell family. The commanding presence of law enforcement signaled the absolute end of their reign. There were no more lies to spin, and no more checks to write. They were going to walk out of my restaurant in handcuffs. Justice had finally arrived, and I was going to watch every second of it unfold right before my eyes tonight. The heavy mahogany doors burst open. The sheer force of the entry made the crystal chandeliers rattle above us. A team of federal agents, flanked by local Atlanta police officers, flooded into the opulent VIP suite. Their dark tactical gear and gleaming badges created a harsh, unforgiving contrast against the delicate silk wallpaper and the scattered remnants of our $12,000 dinner. My general manager stood calmly in the hallway, having personally directed the authorities straight to our private room, exactly as I had instructed. Winston did not even try to run. He did not yell or demand to call his high-priced lawyers. The booming, arrogant patriarch who had terrorized me for 32 years vanished in the blink of an eye. He remained slouched in his velvet chair, his face a sickening shade of gray, his breathing shallow and rapid. 2 federal agents approached him from behind. They ordered him to stand. When his legs failed him, they hauled him up by his expensive suit jacket. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the dead silence of the room. It was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The agent began reading him his Miranda rights detailing the charges of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The words hung in the air, permanently destroying the Caldwell family legacy with every single syllable. Kendrick did not possess even a fraction of Winston's paralyzed stoicism. The moment a second pair of agents moved toward him, the arrogant, misogynistic investment banker completely shattered. He collapsed against the edge of the marble dining table and began to weep. It was not a dignified cry. It was a loud, blubbering, pathetic wail. He begged the officers, his voice cracking as he swore he was just following Winston's orders. He threw his own father-in-law under the bus without a second thought, desperately trying to save his own skin. He cried that he had a family, that he was a respected man in Buckhead, that this was all a massive misunderstanding. The agents remained entirely unmoved. They forced his arms behind his back, secured the heavy steel cuffs, and hauled him to his feet. Jada watched her husband sob uncontrollably, her face frozen in absolute horror, fully comprehending that she was now a homeless woman married to a federal criminal. The extended family members, the aunts, uncles, and cousins, who had happily eaten the expensive food and laughed at my expense, shrank back against the far walls. They huddled together like terrified mice, clutching their designer bags, desperate to avoid the splash zone of this spectacular downfall. Not a single one of them stepped forward to defend Winston. Not a single one of them offered a word of comfort to Jada or Kendrick. Their silence was the ultimate proof of the fake, shallow nature of their elite society. They only cared about wealth and status, and the moment those illusions were violently stripped away, their loyalty evaporated instantly. Then the frantic spell of the room was broken by a sudden violent movement. Camille threw herself out of her chair. She scrambled across the polished marble floor, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her beloved country club dignity. She crawled directly toward me, her heavy diamond necklace swinging wildly. She dropped heavily to her knees right at my feet. Her expensive makeup was entirely ruined, running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Before my security team could step in to intercept her, Camille reached out with trembling hands and tightly grabbed the fabric of my tailored designer dress. Her knuckles were white as she clung to the material as if I were the only life raft in a raging ocean. "Naomi, please," she sobbed, her voice a hysterical, grating shriek. "Please stop them. Tell them it is a mistake. You have all the power now. You can make this go away. We are your family. We are blood." I was just trying to keep the family together. We had to maintain the image, Naomi. I did what I had to do for all of us. Please, I am begging you, forgive us. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still and looked down at the woman who had birthed me. I looked at the hands that had systematically packed my belongings in garbage bags 7 years ago and thrown them onto a wet driveway. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing but absolute freezing coldness. The emotional hold she once had over my heart had been completely severed, cauterized by the fires of my own ambition and her unrelenting cruelty. I looked down at her with absolute coldness. I let the silence stretch out, forcing her to wallow in the pathetic reality of her begging. When I finally spoke, my voice was low, steady, and cut through the chaotic noise of the room like a sharpened blade. "Toxic family loyalty is a disease," I stated, ensuring every single person huddled in that room heard my words. "You wrap it up in pretty convenient concepts like tradition and respect, but it is nothing more than a heavy chain designed to keep everyone miserable and trapped together. You use the word blood as a weapon to demand blind compliance and silent suffering. You did not want a family. You wanted a cult. You wanted obedient little soldiers who would sacrifice their own happiness to prop up your massive, fragile egos." Camille let out a strangled gasp, shaking her head frantically, her tears soaking into the hem of my dress. But I did not stop. The truth had been buried for too long, and it was time to drag it out into the harsh light. "You didn't want a daughter. You wanted a sacrifice," I delivered the words with devastating precision. "You wanted a scapegoat you could blame for your own failures. You wanted someone you could push down, just so you could feel a little bit taller. You spent my whole life making me feel small. You spent years telling me I was a ghetto embarrassment, a failure, a stain on the perfect Caldwell name. You tried to bury me so deep I would never see the sun again. I paused, letting the sheer weight of her failures crush her spirit. But you forgot that a seed buried in the dark eventually learns how to break through the concrete, I said softly, the absolute finality of my victory ringing in every syllable. I broke through the concrete, Camille, and I grew into an empire that just bought your entire existence. With a swift, decisive motion, I reached down and physically grabbed her wrists. I did not use excessive force, but my grip was unyielding. I pulled my dress violently from Camille's frantic grip, breaking her physical hold on me just as completely as I had broken her emotional hold. She fell forward, her hands slapping against the cold marble floor, letting out a loud, agonizing wail of pure despair. I stepped back, smoothing the fabric of my outfit, restoring my immaculate appearance. I turned to the lead federal agent who was waiting patiently for my cue. I gave him a single sharp nod. The agents moved in unison. They hauled Winston toward the mahogany doors. My father, the great logistics mogul, stumbled over his own feet, his head bowed, utterly destroyed. They dragged Kendrick right behind him. The arrogant banker was still crying loudly, his tears leaving wet spots on his expensive silk tie. The heavy doors closed behind them, shutting out the wailing sirens and leaving behind a profound ringing silence in the VIP suite. Jada was curled into a tight ball in her chair, staring blankly at the wall, completely catatonic. The rest of the family remained frozen in the corners, terrified to move, terrified to breathe, terrified that I might turn my vengeful gaze upon them next. But I had absolutely no interest in them. They were irrelevant. They were just ghosts haunting a graveyard they had dug themselves. I turned to my security team and instructed them to clear the remaining guests from my property immediately. I did not wait to watch them leave. I had spent enough of my life watching the Caldwell family perform their fake elite routines. I picked up my designer bag, turned my back on the weeping ruin of my mother, and walked out of the private dining room. I walked down the quiet, dimly lit hallway of the Onyx Room. My staff stood at respectful attention, bowing slightly as I passed. I stepped out through the grand entrance and into the warm, humid Atlanta night. The flashing red and blue lights were already disappearing down the street, carrying my abusers away to federal holding cells. My chauffeur stood by the open door of my Maybach. He offered a polite nod as I slid into the luxurious leather back seat. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing me inside a quiet, peaceful sanctuary. I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes. The knot of anxiety that had lived in my chest since childhood was completely gone. The heavy, suffocating shadow of the Caldwell family had been permanently eradicated. I had faced the demons of my past, stripped them of their power, and evicted them from my life forever. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the sweet, undeniable flavor of absolute victory. The engine purred to life, and the car pulled away from the curb, carrying me forward into a beautiful, unburdened future. I yanked the premium fabric of my tailored dress from Camille's desperate grip with a single sharp motion. She collapsed forward instantly, her palms slapping hard against the cold marble floor of the VIP suite. Her diamond bracelets clattered violently against the stone, a hollow, chaotic sound that perfectly matched the destruction of her fake elite reality. I looked down at her with absolute, unwavering coldness. She was no longer the intimidating, judgmental matriarch who had dictated every second of my childhood. She was just a broken, heavily indebted woman sobbing on the floor of a restaurant she could no longer afford. The federal agents did not give Winston or Kendrick a single second to process their new reality. They hauled my father up by his expensive suit jacket, forcing his hands violently behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around Winston's wrists echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Kendrick was next. The arrogant, toxic investment banker who had threatened to destroy my catering business just an hour ago was now blubbering like a terrified child. Tears streamed freely down his face, leaving wet, pathetic stains on his silk tie as the agent secured his wrists. He begged the officers, his voice cracking, and high-pitched swearing he was just following his father-in-law's orders. He threw Winston under the bus without a single moment of hesitation. There was absolutely no loyalty among thieves. The lead federal agent gave the command and the procession began. They did not take them out through the discreet back exit to spare their dignity. They marched Winston and Kendrick straight through the heavy mahogany doors and directly into the main dining room of the Onyx Room. The main floor was packed entirely with Atlanta's highest society. Mayors, real estate moguls, tech CEOs, and socialites were enjoying their lavish dinners. As the Caldwell men were paraded into the open, the gentle jazz music and the quiet clinking of crystal glasses stopped completely. A dead, suffocating silence fell over the entire restaurant. Winston kept his head bowed, his face burning with a humiliating bright red flush. He had spent his entire life obsessing over his reputation, meticulously curating his image as an untouchable titan of the black elite. Now, every single powerful person in the city was watching him do a public perp walk in federal handcuffs. Smartphones immediately appeared in the air. Camera flashes illuminated Winston's absolute disgrace. The Whisper network of Atlanta high society ignited instantly, sealing his permanent social death right there on the restaurant floor. Kendrick continued to weep loudly, completely shattering whatever alpha male illusion he had left. Back inside the VIP suite, the atmosphere was a graveyard of shattered egos. Jada was still curled on the floor next to her mother, her chest heaving with frantic, hyperventilating gasps. She was clutching the 24-hour eviction notice tightly to her chest, her mind entirely broken by the fact that she was officially homeless. The extended family members, the aunts and uncles who had eagerly eaten on my dime and laughed at my expense, were pressed tightly against the far walls. They looked at me with sheer, unadulterated terror. They were cowards, completely unwilling to speak up for Camille or Jada, silently praying I would not turn my financial crosshairs on them next. The general manager of the Onyx Room stepped forward, his posture impeccably straight, completely unbothered by the sobbing women dirtying his floor. He bowed respectfully toward me, holding his silver tray. He asked me how I would like to handle the remaining guests and the outstanding balance for the evening. I looked at the center of the massive dining table. Resting right next to the empty, discarded shells of premium king crab was the heavy black leather checkbook. The receipt for $12,450 was still sticking out from the binding. The exact bill my father had smugly ordered me to pay as my initiation fee to rejoin their toxic hierarchy. I turned to the manager and pointed directly at the leather booklet. Hand that bill to Camille and Jada, I instructed, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. Since their credit cards are currently frozen under federal investigation and their physical assets belong entirely to my private equity firm, they cannot pay it with cash. You can escort them to the kitchen. They can wash dishes in the back until the police come to seize their remaining assets tomorrow morning. Jada let out a strangled, horrified shriek. The golden child, the woman who had mocked my simple catering uniform and bragged aggressively about her $3 million mansion, was being ordered to scrub dirty plates in a commercial sink to pay off her own gluttony. Camille merely sobbed harder, burying her face completely into her trembling hands, utterly defeated. I did not wait to watch the security guards lift them off the floor. I picked up my designer bag, turned my back on the weeping ruins of the Caldwell family, and walked out of the VIP suite without a single ounce of regret. When I stepped into the main dining hall, the atmosphere shifted instantly. My staff stood at respectful attention. The powerful diners who had just witnessed my family's humiliating arrest parted like the Red Sea to let me pass. They looked at me with a mixture of profound shock and deep respect. The rumor was already rapidly spreading through the tables that the young woman in the simple black suit was the stealth hospitality billionaire who had orchestrated the entire magnificent takedown. I pushed through the heavy glass front doors of the Onyx Room and stepped out into the warm, humid Atlanta night. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers were already disappearing down the street, carrying my abusers away to federal holding cells. The night air tasted incredibly sweet. My chauffeur stood waiting patiently by the open door of my sleek black Maybach. He offered a polite, knowing nod as I slid into the luxurious, quiet sanctuary of the leather back seat. The heavy door clicked shut, instantly sealing out the noise of the city. I leaned my head back against the plush headrest and closed my eyes, letting a profound, absolute peace wash over my entire soul. For 32 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of their expectations, their cruelty, and their constant bitter disappointment. I had allowed their toxic definition of family to make me feel small and insignificant. 7 years ago, they threw me out into the pouring rain entirely convinced that I would starve without their wealth. But tonight, the chains were permanently broken. I looked out the tinted window as the city lights blurred past. I realized in the quiet comfort of the car that the greatest revenge was never about taking their money, seizing their mansions, or destroying their corporate careers. The ultimate sweetest payoff was completely internal. True revenge is proving that your light shines the absolute brightest, the exact moment you cut the dead weight loose forever. I had survived their darkness, built an untouchable empire, and aggressively protected my peace. The engine purred to life, and the Maybach pulled smoothly away from the curb, carrying me forward into a beautiful, completely unburdened future. The game was permanently over, and I had unquestionably won.